So hey guys, we're back with another podcast, and today we have Sam Dolan. And if you don't know who Sam Dolan or Samuel K. Dolan is, by the end of the podcast, you're going to be like, oh my God, this is the greatest guy ever. Of course, I want to thank my friends over the Tombstone Epitaph. That is Arizona's longest running newspaper. You can find them at tombstoneepitaph.com. And it's 1 year for $25 for a 1 year subscription. $45 for 2 years or 3 years for $60. Honestly, do the 3 years for $60 and it'll save you $15 overall. And it's just a great value. And again, you get Sam because I know he's a contributor, and it's Mark Boardman and Eric Wright. They just do a phenomenal job over there at the Epitaph. And so check them out at tombstoneepitaph.com. I also want to thank my friends at the Wild West History Association. You can find them at wildwesthistory.org. Are you a member, Sam?
Yes, I am. I am a member of the Wild West History Association. Great group of people, researchers, historians, authors, collectors, about the nicest people you'll ever meet. They put out a great publication during the year with just wonderful articles written by historians who are all a lot smarter than I am. So that is a great organization to be a part of.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because if you would have said no, the interview would have been over. It would have been done. And so, yeah, check them out at wildwesthistory.org. And we have the roundup coming up in July in Rapid City, and hopefully I will see you there. Also, if you want to find out more about Sam Dolan and what Sam has got going on, you can visit his website at www.samuelkdolan.com. And that is just like it sounds, SAMUELK, the letter K, Dolan, DOLAN.com. And so check him out. He's got his books there, his comings and goings, the things he's involved with. And again, that's SamuelKDolan.com. So I ran through how I came to wanting to interview Sam was through a couple of ways. John Bosnecker, a mutual friend, I've never met him, but I know that Samuel has. And John said, you got to buy this book called El Paso. And John, I believe, was involved in the book. And if John recommends it, I'm going to do it. I had no idea who Sam Dolan was. I went down and bought the book. I'm still reading through it. Now, when you get the book, El Paso, I'm going to warn you, this is not a negative comment. It's a deep dive. So if you're looking for like a book on fluff, just fluff about El Paso, this is probably not the book. I would definitely go get it anyways, but it's a deep dive. Samuel has deeply researched with true provenance everything that happened in a period of time in El Paso in the late 1800s, dates, addresses, locations, exact dates, exact locations of killings, murders, crossing back and forth into Mexico, how the formation of El Paso, Texas, why it became known as El Paso. It's a fantastic book, and you're going to want to go get it. Also, a little bio about him. He's an award-winning producer. Got huge production credits. I'm not going to go to him. You can research him on Google or DuckDuckGo at Samuel K. Dolan Researcher. Excuse me. His production credits include work on the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, National Geographic. He's also served as an interpretive specialist for the United States Marine Corps Historical Company. He began his career at age 13 on the movie Tombstone, which we're going to talk about, and Maverick. He's busy all through the 90s and 2000s, and he's doing so much stuff. And then in the middle of it, he ends up winning an Emmy for his production, or being a producer, one of the producers, on History Channel's A Distant Shore, African Americans of D-Day. It's a History Channel special that highlights the role of African American soldiers in the Normandy invasion, which would be a whole nother podcast. If he says yes to coming back, I'm going to butter him up so he'll say, yes, Mike, I'll come back. And And then he did some stuff with the Navajo Nation police in Arizona. And then he wrote and produced a pilot of Navajo Cops. I mean, what hasn't he done? On the weekends, I think he does auto detailing. I'm pretty sure he does auto detailing. But he's done.
On the weekends, I try to be a dad as much as possible. But yeah, it's a busy schedule.
Holy cow. So he's done it all. He's just a fantastic guy. Now, he's got a great story, and we're going to talk about his tombstone. But I read an article in True West magazine. I believe it was True West magazine. And in the very back of the magazine, they do an author or a historian or researcher, somebody that's doing amazing work in Western history. And they had him in the back, and I was like, holy crap, I got to interview this guy. Because you're born and raised in Arizona. Maybe not born, but were you born here?
No, I grew up in Arizona, and I spent a lot of my life there. Growing up and then as an adult, before I had to camp to other places to work in television. But, I was actually born in Essex County, Massachusetts, which is about as far east as you can get, in the continental United States. I was born in Newburyport, which is an old maritime city. In fact, I'm named after an ancestor who died at sea. My father's family was all from back east. My grandfather was a state representative there. There's a lot of history in that part of the world. I just didn't live there very long. My mother was from out west, and so at one point when I was just a little guy, we headed west and went to Arizona, and that's sort of where my life began in a way. A lot of the things you've talked about, I mean, Arizona was sort of the launching pad for all of that. And that's, Arizona has a lot to do with who I am and what I became. But it all does start in New England, in Massachusetts, and all my colonial ancestors and what have you.
You mentioned that you spent time in Sedona. And Sedona is a tourist destination as much as a Grand Canyon, because people come from all over the world to come to Sedona to see the red rocks, to see the iconic church, to swim in the beautiful waters, and then the metaphysical stuff that's going on. How is it growing up in Sedona? I mean, don't spend a lot of time on it, but how is it growing up in a place where people flock to?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Because the town has changed, and my folks still live there. My father and my stepmother is a pretty well known Western artist in that part of the world. But when we moved there initially in the if you lived in Sedona anytime between the late 70s, the 1980s, and into the 1990s, it still had sort of a small town sort of feel to it, and it is a beautiful place. It was still a great destination. This just changed a little bit. And some of the things you mentioned, some of the metaphysical things and things, those became more popular and more of a draw as time went by. So I saw Sedona for the first time when it was like in a period of transition, where it still felt like a lot of other small towns in Yavapai or Coconino County, Arizona. And it became something different in a way. And it has changed. And of course it is a beautiful place. It was really a wonderful thing to grow up there. Where I lived a lot of the time was in an area that's sort of known as Elmerville. It's kind of outside the town limits in Yavapai County. And we had horses, and I had access to all this wonderful national forest to play in and to ride horses in. It was just a great way to grow up. But no, just a beautiful part of the world. And I'm really blessed that I got to spend so much time there.
And as you were growing up, because I know you get asked a lot about Tombstone.
Sure.
As you, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time because, it whatever. But because we have so much to cover. You're growing up, you're 13 years old. How does a young kid from Sedona end up in a movie with Kurt Russell and Val Kilmer and all these wonderful people on Tombstone?
Well, I'll give you hopefully a concise version of that story. And there's a few names I have to throw out there because there were a few people that, kind of came into that. In 1992, a production company called Greystone Communications, which ironically was a company I went to work for as a producer years later, they came to Sedona to shoot sort of reenactment footage for a series they were doing called The Real West that was hosted by Kenny Rogers. And they needed some guys to ride and do cowboy scenes and some of the footage. And so an artist, well-known Western artist named Jerry Crandall, who lived in Arizona at the time, he lives in Montana now, he put together a group of guys, and he got my father involved in that. Well, a few months later, Jerry was helping Peter Sherayko, who is an actor in the movie Tombstone and was very involved in that movie, put together, what became known as buckaroos, these guys that would ride in the movie Tombstone. They would be sort of the Red Sash gang, kind of ancillary members of the gang, and do a lot of other stuff. So my father got to be a part of that. And just before the movie Tombstone was supposed to start filming, so this is like May of 93, so a little over 29 years ago, they had to scale back the numbers of these buckaroos. And so my father was sort of struck from the roster. But a guy named Frank Costanza, who was a Montana saddle maker and a real Westerner. I mean, this guy was the real deal and just a wonderful human being. He got down to Tucson, put a good word in for my dad when they ended up needing more of these cowboys to come back. So my father kind of got rehired for the movie. And then a few weeks later, I get out of the 7th grade and I go down to Tucson to sort of hang around with my dad. It's summer break. I don't have anything else to do. And Peter Sherayko got me hired on initially as an extra, and then later as one of the buckaroos. I was 13 years old. I got to ride my own horse and carry my own 45 and wear a red sash, at least a little bit. But that's how I spent the summer vacation between the 7th and 8th grade, was working with all of these, just fascinating people, legends like Harry Carey Jr. and great actors like the late Powers Booth, and really wonderful, nice people like Bill Paxton. And so, yeah, that was the adventure of my sort of childhood, was getting to work on that movie with my dad.
Did you have a chance to speak with the actors, or were they, as soon as the scene was over, I'm in my trailer?
We all talked quite a bit. Some more than others. Kurt Russell was a very approachable and decent guy, and I talked to him quite a bit. My first day on the movie, I end up in a 2-shot with Kurt Russell at the train station, the old train station at Old Tucson. This was pre-1995 fire at Old Tucson, so it was much like the set that you see in the John Wayne movies and in Joe Kidd and all those things. So we're at the train station. It's a scene where Kurt gets down off the train. He first arrives in Arizona, takes his horse away from this guy that's whipping it.
Yep.
And U.S. Marshal walks up to Wyatt Earp to ask him if he wants a job. Kurt turns to me, hands me the lead rope to his horse, and says, "Easy on the grain, Butch," and he gives me a $1.
Oh,
I have a 2-shot with Kurt Russell. And that was my first day of working in the film and television business. And that was just great. I said, wow, this is great. This is a lot of fun. Sky's the limit, right? And so I got to meet Sam Elliott that day, and Bill Paxton, and so many of the other actors that were there, and they were all just wonderful people. Sam Elliott is as close as it gets to people anymore like Ben Johnson or John Wayne or Randolph Scott. He's a real Western movie legend, right? And that was already pretty well established in the early 90s. So he's my hero. I get to meet Sam Elliott on my first day of working on this movie. And I was there for probably the next 12 weeks, really all the way up to the moment the movie wrapped. And so, you get to know some of these people, and some were, more approachable than others. And actors all have different processes, but for the most part, you get to know just about everybody during that length of time on a project. And it was great. It was challenging, but it was great.
That is so freaking crazy. I love that. If you guys don't know, we're talking to Samuel. Do you go by Samuel or Sam?
My friends just call me Sam. I use that Samuel as just an acknowledgement of my ancestors and the old family name. But no, everybody that knows me just calls me Sam, and that's fine.
All right. So I'm talking. We were talking to Sam Dolan. You can find out more about Sam at samuelkdolan.com. He's an author of several books, Paso, which is the one that I have, Cowboys and Gangsters, and I hope when he's all done with this, he'll say, I want to come back. He's got a new book coming out with a tentative date, a release date of September 22 called The Line Riders. And that's Prohibition and Liquor War along the Rio Grande. And that one's going to be an amazing book. I can't wait for it to come out. And again, has a release date, a tentative release date of September 2022. And you can find it at Amazon and booksellers near you. When you completed the movie Tombstone, then you just became this everyday kid, which you were an everyday kid. When your friends saw the movie Tombstone, were they like, what? Where were you gone? Why didn't you say something? What was that like?
I probably didn't disguise it that much, so I don't think it was too big of a surprise at that point. But because I was a kid, I was pretty proud of the fact that was how I spent my summer vacation, if I'm honest. No, I mean, it was kind of a thing, I guess, amongst my friends in school. I mean, it was a thing that I had done, and kind of in a sort of way known for, because I also did Maverick.
Right.
Worked on Maverick that same year. My dad had been James Garner's double when they were shooting in northern Arizona and in Utah, and so I worked on that for maybe a couple of weeks altogether, and one episode of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles about that same time. So by the time I got to high school, I'd worked on 3 or 4 features and TV show and maybe a commercial or two. And at that point, I decided that I wanted to do something in film and television in my life. I wasn't sure quite, what that would be. Maybe I'd be an actor. I tried that for a while. I did a little bit of everything. But yeah, I mean, by the time I was in high school, I kind of had my heart set on this line of work.
So since you had your heart set on it, what was the next transition? What was the next move going forward? Did you go to college? Did you go to a film school? Or was the entertainment industry, since you've already been in it, was it just a natural segue for you to get out of high school and just continue on? Like, explain that, because that kind of sets us up into, at some point you said to your wife or family, I want to write a book.
Sure. Yeah. So when I got out of high school, I went to work pretty quickly for a man named Jack Bartlett, and Jack had written episodes of the Gunsmoke series, and he and his son Kyle, they owned a production company in the Phoenix area, and so I moved to Scottsdale, and during the day I would work at this production company. It was called Laredo Productions, and I worked there for probably about 3 years. And I would go to school at Scottsdale Community College, which had a really good film program. I imagine it still does. And I went to school there at night most of the time. I had some day classes, but went to school at night. I worked in TV during the day, went to school at night, and then on weekends I tried what a lot of film students try to do. I'm going to write a screenplay this weekend, or all these sort of abortive and aspirational projects. Mm-hmm. And I spent, altogether, I spent, a few years in the Phoenix, area, consistently, and then off and on, and I would commute, but eventually had to eventually make that transition to Los Angeles, initially sort of on a part-time basis. And I eventually moved there, because at the time it was hard to get steady work in film and TV outside of LA or New York. So I'll sort of, kind of tighten this sort of chronology up for you. So I go to Los Angeles. I eventually made my way into Greystone Communications, which is that same company that did the Real West all those years earlier, that hired my dad, that led to the whole Tombstone thing. So I went to work at Greystone Communications, and that's where I became a producer, working with some really wonderful peers and friends who were great mentors to me. And did a lot of World War II shows, and an Old West series called Wild West Tech, with both Keith and David Carradine. They were the hosts at different times. And that's how my producing career began. And I worked for some other companies there in LA as well, but I did a lot of documentaries. a lot of sort of reenactment heavy documentaries where you have both sort of archival footage and interviews, and then also you try to do battle scenes and things kind of on a low budget kind of way. And just had great experiences and eventually had opportunities to write shows. And that's how I essentially became a writer, was writing, episodes of series like Battle 360 about USS Enterprise and World War II, for History Channel and shows like that. And time goes by. And for me, I kind of get over that period of my life where, I want to write a screenplay, because still everybody always wants to do that. You go to film school, you want to write a screenplay and do that whole thing. And, you're just constantly hitting your head against the wall, trying to come up with ideas. I was always interested in telling true stories, what's the next Tombstone going to be? And those are really hard movies to write or even make or get sold. And eventually I'm like, well, there are these interesting stories I just really want to tell that they're less well known. They involve characters that aren't household names like Billy the Kid, Wyatt Earp. And how do I do that? And fortunately, I had met John Bosnecker working on Wild West Tech, and he especially was a huge mentor and friend to me, and he kind of coached me along. And I had other writer friends that would look at drafts of book proposals, because I'm like, I want to actually write a book about some of this stuff. And that's how the whole Cowboys and Gangsters book came to be, was me just trying to take stories that you just can't make TV shows out of and try to include them in a book. And some of them were stories that were somewhat known, at least in the Southwest, and some were lesser known stories, incidents involving lawmen and outlaws in a kind of a later period of time. And yeah, thanks to John Bosnecker and so many other wonderful mentors, eventually took a book proposal to Two Dot, and they publish a lot of great Western books. And they basically gave me my start. And now I've just recently finished up my third book for Two Dot. And they've just been wonderful folks to work with.
I've got to go way, way back, though.
Sure.
I want to go way back.
You can go as far back as you'd like.
Okay. I want to go back in an earlier, before we go forward, because I'm intrigued by it like crazy. You did a series called on the History Channel called Battle 360.
Yes, sir.
Is that you narrating it? Not narrating it, because I think it's Bryan Cranston, but there was a shot of a young man sitting there talking about the bombs coming down out of the planes as the American pilots were flying. Correct? Is flying over an aircraft.
I was an occasional interviewee in some of those shows, usually not episodes that I would write, because it's sort of weird to interview yourself. But I would occasionally be sort of a talking head interview for some of those shows. At that point, I had become a member of the U.S. Marine Corps Historical Company. Wow. And it was one of the civilian, sort of like an interpretive specialist, and you do a lot of research, and we would go down and help set up displays for like the Iwo Jima reunion dinner and things like that. So I would occasionally do interviews on certain World War II topics, naval and things in particular. I mean, my grandfather had been in the Pacific as a sailor during World War II, and just had a love and affinity for those things. And so, yeah, if you look at Battle 360 from all those years ago, you'll occasionally see a somewhat younger, considerably younger version.
I was going to say,
of myself.
Don't say somewhat younger.
That's already been about 15 years ago. Talking about, I think I'm interviewed in the Battle of Leyte Gulf at one point. A couple of other episodes, but that show was a favorite of mine personally, and then a lot of my colleagues in the office, Ryan Hurst, who's a great producer, and Brian Thompson, and another great producer who's a friend of mine and was a great mentor. We got to interview all of these sailors and members of the Marine Detachment and pilots. And I'm talking pilots that that flew at Midway, that helped sink the Japanese carriers at Midway. legendary, pilots, members of the air groups that flew in the Pacific, that were, in the air battles around Guadalcanal, which were, incredibly terrifying battles, and so many other incidents. I mean, and to sit and visit with these wonderful people, and that at that point, many of these gents were in their 90s, and there was this realization, obviously, that this generation was slipping away with just the passage of time. And so there was an urgency to setting up these interviews and getting these stories. And it was such an experience to sit with these veterans for several hours, usually at a time, and get them to open up and tell you their stories. And some of these stories were, they were incredible stories, stories of heroism, humorous stories, funny things that just happen among people in the service, very tragic stories at times. I mean, things that you hear and they stay with you because somebody imparts something like that. They share a thing with you, what it was like to bury shipmates at sea after a battle like the battle at the Eastern Solomons or the Santa Cruz Island or Midway. And you just never forget something like that. And, my grandfather had fought in World War II as a young sailor on a cruiser, sort of towards the end of the Pacific War. And so I felt, it was that show.
Like a kindred spirit.
Was meeting these veterans. I mean, we interviewed Swede Vedeza, admiral, retired admiral. Swede Vedeza, by the fall of 1942, he was already an ace. And as I recall, in October 1942, in one battle, I think he accounted for 4 or 5 or maybe even 6 Japanese aircraft as a fighter pilot. And to sit in that man's room with his whole family, his children who were all adults, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, and just hear those stories. I mean, it was just incredible. It was just a wonderful experience, just a real highlight of my life.
Then, and that's, I honestly, if I had the chance to do that, it's probably how I am now. I'm staring at the phone, listening to your stories, and it's amazing. You did a series for the History Channel. You were the producer, and we spoke about it in a pre-interview called The Distant Shore, African Americans of D-Day. Two things.
Yeah.
That story, and I watched, and if you guys want to see it, you can go on YouTube and literally type in Distant Shore, African Americans on D-Day, and you'll see his work, which is insane in every aspect. Because then you won an Emmy. And I've never spoken to an Emmy winner. And do you have it in the house and walk by and go, hey buddy, or do you sometimes sit in the living room at night at 1 a.m. and put them on the coffee table and watch that? I mean, what is it like to win an Emmy, and what do you do with it?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Well, yeah, the special, A Distant Shore, African Americans of D-Day, it was a really special program to be a part of. It was produced by Flight 33 Productions, which was a company I worked for at the time. I was a producer on the show. Douglas Cohen was the executive producer and wrote the special. And there were a good number of other people that were involved in the show that came together to tell a really important story about African American servicemen in one of the most pivotal battles of World War II, the invasion of Normandy. And it was great. I mean, it was a really wonderful experience to be a part of something like that and pull up this footage that was really, rare and hard to come by. And set up interviews with veterans that, in the 1990s and the early 2000s, there were a lot of World War II documentaries. And many of these veterans had never been interviewed before, or had been interviewed perhaps very rarely. And so it was a great opportunity for them to tell their stories as well. And, and then, of course, we were nominated for Emmys. I mean, just to be nominated for an Emmy was just nothing I had ever expected, because I grew up in Arizona and lived in Elmerville outside of Sedona. And, I didn't think I would get an Emmy nomination. So that was a big deal. And then in September of 2008, we won for, I think it was under the category of Best Long Form Documentary at the News and Documentary Emmys in New York. So it was a big deal to go to New York City and go to the Lincoln Center, and Bob Schieffer from CBS, I think, maybe announced the awards, or at least gave a talk before. I mean, he shook our hands. Wow. And it was all sort of like a blur, because it was sort of surreal to stand on that stage and, and look at that statue. And I have it in my house. It becomes part of your career in a sense. It becomes the kind of thing that you put on your resume. But at the same time, I don't have it out where people really see it that often. It's here in my home office. I don't hide the fact that I've got it, but when I look at it, and I'm looking at it right now, I'm proud of receiving it, but I have to remember how it all came to be.
Right.
And what I mostly think about were the fine young men that landed at Omaha and Utah Beach on June 6th of 1944. And that is the sort of gravity of it. And one thing I was really sort of proud to be a part of, I don't want to take credit for it in a way, but I think it was about a year after the Emmys, I talked to a man. He himself was, I believe, a retired officer, and he helped sponsor American veterans to receive the Legion of Honor from the French government for their services in France or in French territories during World War II. And one of our veterans from a distant shore was a Coast Guard veteran, and his name was John Noble Roberts. And John Noble Roberts was a steward's mate aboard LCIL 93, which was a transport vessel. It was one of the many ships and vessels that was carrying American infantry to Omaha Beach on D-Day. And this vessel was struck by enemy artillery fire, and John lost his leg on D-Day. And I think it was an 88 millimeter shell passed through the bulkhead and exploded underneath him. And it took, I believe it was his right leg and off at the knee. And a medic, put a tourniquet on John. John laid on the deck. Shells were still bracketing the ship. He told me what it was like to lay there, and seawater was splashing on him while he was laying there. And he recovered. Of course, he'd lost his leg. He had a long life. He had a very wonderful family. So I was asked to recommend, hey, is there somebody that you would like to help sponsor for the Legion of Honor that's here in California, that's a veteran? And so John was that person. And a packet was put together, and John was invited to a ceremony at the French consulate in Los Angeles. I got to go. And it was a really special moment for John in his life and for his family to be there with the French consulate at the residence there, I think in Beverly Hills. And all these other veterans are there. Medal of Honor recipients like Walter Ehlers from the 1st Infantry Division and members of the NISE, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. All these really fascinating men are there, and John was among them. And it was a wonderful tribute to John to receive this acknowledgement of his service in liberating France, and officers from the Coast Guard were there. It was just great. When I look at the Emmy Award, I think of people like John Noble Roberts, who gave a lot for our country in that massive crusade to help save liberal democracy for the modern world. And that's what I think about when I look at that statue.
Wow. That's an amazing story. That's phenomenal. If you're wondering who we're talking to Sam Dolan. You can find out more about Sam Dolan at samuelkdolan.com. Was there a point in your career after this was going on, because you're still actively involved in film and television?
Yes.
That you said to yourself, or maybe you and your wife or colleagues, and you said, this is going to make it sound so stupid when I'm going to say it. And don't say, yeah, Mike, that's stupid. Where you were going through this period, you're working successful, an Emmy, you're doing this, the Emmy then put you in demand with other people, because all of a sudden you became somebody that people took notice of, offers, things are coming at you, people want you involved. And yet still you said, I want to write Western history. I think that you were probably always in your mind, in the back of your mind, always loving it, and you were reading it, and then John Bosnecker and other people coming in and out of your life. But there was still a time to when you said, I want to get involved in Western history. I want to be a researcher. I want to write. I want to tell a story. What happened to where El Paso came about?
Well, I'm not an academic. That's a great question, by the way. It's not at all a stupid question. I'm not an academic historian. You know, I went to film school. I've worked in TV as a documentary producer for a lot of my life. And yeah, I think that it was a point of like, well, I enjoy writing. I actually enjoy writing, and I like research, and I love stories. And I wanted to tell stories, and when you just like telling stories, you're looking for an outlet to tell a story. And it may come as no surprise, it's really hard to sit down at a desk and write like a feature-length Western movie that you can then take somewhere and hope that it gets made. You know, that through some miracle that script will become an actual movie. And so you're looking for ways to have something to contribute maybe, and create a thing and learn while you're doing it. Because I'm no great historian, and I still consider myself a student. I am a student of people like John Bosnecker and Chuck Parsons and Bob Alexander and so many others. And yet I wanted to be a part of that somehow, and maybe find some stories that hadn't been highlighted as often as certain other stories. And that's how that all kind of coalesced. I was in I guess it's already been about 10 years when I started writing Cowboys and Gangsters. El Paso was sort of an outgrowth of that, and indeed The Line Riders is still sort of an outgrowth of that. I feel like I've been kind of working on maybe one biggish book for, maybe almost a decade now. It came about, as I mentioned, with a lot of support and suggestions and advice and no short amount of patience on behalf of John Bosnecker and just as a mentor. I put together a book proposal, which is kind of like writing a small book. Got a lot of notes from agents and friends, and I had to make some corrections, and still doing research and figuring out what some of the stories were going to be, and looking for court records and personnel files and things like that. And my first book, Cowboys and Gangsters, came out a little over 6 years ago. El Paso came out almost 2 years ago, I guess. And that was just sort of an outgrowth. It involved historical figures that I had started researching that were lawmen in El Paso, Texas, whose careers spanned basically the late 19th century into the early 20th century. So for me, El Paso is kind of like really connected to Cowboys and Gangsters. It has a lot of the same people in it, in a sense. It just fascinated by the stories. I mean, El Paso, Texas is one of the most historical cities in North America. It is and I have a real fondness for El Paso and the people there. Many of them, I've gotten to know, people at the special collections at University of Texas at El Paso and the Border Heritage Center at the El Paso Public Library. I mean, just these wonderful people that have been so helpful over the years. Folks at the Border Patrol Museum. And there's so many stories in El Paso. And it's not just one story. I mean, the story of El Paso, Texas is the story of the native peoples of the Southwest and the Spanish and Mexico and the United States, and this crossroads of culture and so many other things. And it's just such a wonderful story and history. Obviously, in El Paso, I kind of talk about kind of the darker parts of the city's history. I deal with crime in that book, and there was a significant amount of crime in El Paso between the 1880s and the early 20th century. And why was that? Well, a lot of things sort of contribute to that. It was a sort of a remote, isolated community on the international boundary as of the late 1870s. Paso del Norte, which became Juarez, was really more kind of the center of gravity. It was an older sister of El Paso with its own rich history. And the El Paso on the other side of the river was, it was kind of an outpost. It had gone by different names at different times. And in the late 1870s and the early 1880s, it experienced a boom. And a lot of that was driven by the arrival of first the Southern Pacific Railroad, and then the Santa Fe, and then other railroads that all converged there. And as a result, it became a huge draw for commerce and trade and transportation. And it's the kind of setting where you also had a thriving red light district and a lot of gambling and many, many saloons. And just as in any other Western town that has those elements, it attracts a variety of people, a very colorful cast of saloon keepers and brothel madams and outlaws and gunmen and gamblers, and of course lawmen who are called upon to bring order to places like that. And so from the 1880s onward, El Paso became a real destination for a variety of people, including some of the most famous gunmen and outlaws in the history of the West. Of course, John Wesley Hardin probably being the premier among them, but quite a few others as well. And so as a result, it was a place where things happened. There was a lot of violence in El Paso. There was a lot of violence in places like Dodge City and Tombstone and Deadwood, but I would say that in El Paso, that trend of sort of gunfighters and lawlessness, it went on for a long time. So there's a lot of reasons for that. And there's just so many stories. Of course, there are famous people like John Wesley Hardin that are covered in El Paso, and there are many, many lesser known figures. So it offered an opportunity to explore violence in the Victorian West, not just traditional violence, gunfighters versus gunfighters or lawmen versus outlaws, etc., but violence that occurs among other groups of people. There are incidents of domestic violence that lead to homicide in this book. There are suicides. There are things that are not often a part of the popular version of the Outlaw West. And I'm not the only one that's ever done that. There are great historians that have delved into those topics. But in terms of the El Paso story, those were places I kind of wanted to go. So in this book, I try to tell a variety of different types of stories.
Because you mentioned, and I'm going to get it wrong, I know I will, and you can correct me. Do you know Peter Brand? He corrects me all the time, and I love him for it.
I do. I've never met Peter Brand, but of course I know who he is. He's another one of these just wonderful historians that contribute so much to the study of all of this.
Well, I love him. He comes on my podcast, and we talk all the time. And when we don't talk, I miss talking to him. There was a mention in your book, and I tried to find it because I went to El Paso about a month and a half ago.
Mm-hmm.
I was so excited because I do air conditioning for a living, and they said, "Hey, we need you to go to El Paso and look at this job." Oh my God, thank you. And this is no lie. I got into the truck, I got to my hotel, and then got over the Concordia Cemetery and saw John Wesley Hardin's grave. And but what I didn't have time for was there was in your book about a lawman, I believe, that was killed in a canyon. And now that canyon is named after him, and most of the people. Do you remember that part?
Yeah, I think you're referring to Charles Fusselman.
Yes, Fusselman Canyon.
Yeah, Fusselman had been a member of the Texas Rangers. He'd been, I believe, first sergeant in Company D under Frank Jones, and he then became a deputy United States Marshal. And he was a deputy United States Marshal there for the Western District. So he spent a lot of time in West Texas. And in 1890, he was killed in a shootout in the hills, just above the Franklin Mountains, just above El Paso. And that area now bears his name, Fusselman Canyon. And there's a highway that kind of cuts through that area. Mm-hmm. And you can kind of go up there and get a sense of the terrain, which obviously hasn't changed all that much. And I think on a certain sort of day, you can get a real feel for what occurred there. El Paso is a modern city. It's been one of those cities in America that grows and it changes and it renews itself, and it keeps evolving. And so, you can't really walk the streets of El Paso and see the El Paso of John Wesley Hardin or even Charles Fusselman, but you can kind of find places that still, you just feel that kind of connection. And that area is one of them. And Fusselman was killed in a shootout, in 1890. Years went by in terms of, members of that particular gang, being apprehended and, tried for Fusselman's murder. One was eventually hanged in El Paso County about a decade afterwards. But yeah, Charles Fusselman, he met with a pretty sudden and tragic end up there.
Well, we have about 5 minutes. It goes by fast.
It sure does. I did a lot of talking. I'm sorry.
No. You're doing exactly what I want, and you have a great speaking voice. I think you should get your Emmy and talk about your Emmy, because I would come see it. We have about 5 minutes. You have a new book coming out. I'm hoping you'll come back when the book releases and I read it and then we can do it. I'm hoping you'll say yes. The book is called The Line Riders. Comes out and releases, tentative date of September 2022, Prohibition and Liquor War along the Rio Grande. Can you tell us a little bit about the book?
Sure. It was a book that I started doing research for way back when I was working on Cowboys and Gangsters. In fact, I sort of go over a few incidents that were in my first book and then a lot more. But The Line Riders is essentially about the officers of both the Immigration Services Border Patrol and the Customs Service during the Prohibition era. And in the old days, pre-Prohibition, late 19th century, early 20th century, the federal lawmen, especially among the Customs Service on the border, were often referred to as line riders, or river guards, or river riders, things like that. But this is the precursor to, the modern, Customs Border Patrol. And the focus of this book, The Line Riders, is on the Prohibition era. I talk a little bit about, things from an earlier period of time, but the main focus is on the Prohibition era along the Rio Grande in Texas, and also on the border in Arizona, New Mexico, and a little bit of California material in there as well. Obviously, Prohibition was a very chaotic and violent time throughout the United States. On the U.S.-Mexico border, it was incredibly violent. There were many gunfights between federal lawmen and smugglers. on the international boundary. Many of those happened in and around El Paso, Texas. That was a big area for liquor smuggling during Prohibition. And that is essentially what the book is about. It tells the stories of these officers and the incidents that they were involved in during the 1920s and 30s.
I can't wait for it to come out. Because is John involved in that one?
Well, John has been a mentor to me for a long time. Obviously, I pick John's brain a lot with ideas and things, and he's been a good friend all through this time. As have other historians. I mean, when you do this stuff, you get to meet a lot of great people. Historians, members of the Wild West History Association and others. A historian named Joseph Banco, who's been writing a sort of a big multi-volume history of the Border Patrol. He was, a friend while working on this book. You just get to meet so many wonderful people, and you learn a lot from other writers and other historians, and it just becomes part of your ongoing education as you keep doing this. I mean, you're never, and I think John has said this and others have said it, you're never probably going to be the person that writes the definitive history of one of these incidents in the Old West. The best you can hope to do is make your contribution and keep telling these stories to keep them alive and keep learning and keep getting, and in my case, keep getting better as a writer, I hope, and as a student of all of this. And so I've been so blessed to have friends like John and meet so many other wonderful authors and historians.
I love it. Well, again, we're talking to Sam Dolan. You can find him at www.samuel, S-A-M-U-E-L, Samuel, K, the letter K, Dolan.com. You'll find some information there. When you check in, there'll be a spot for contact on his website. And if you want to leave a comment or a message, or if you have a question, you can go ahead and fill that part out and somebody will get back to you. It may not be him. It may be somebody in his team will get back to you. Of course, I want to thank the I've lost my train of thought. I'm so enamored. Wild West History Association at wildwesthistory.org. And you want to join them because they're a fantastic group. And if honestly, and I tell this, if it wasn't for the WWHA, I would not have Sam on the phone, because the WWHA has opened up a lot of doors for me to interview amazing people, including Bob Bosbell and Marshall Trimble and John and Peter Brand and Mark Boardman. And it just has opened up a ton of doors for me, and they can open up doors for you if you're thinking about writing a book or becoming an historian or researcher, and you can do so at wildwesthistory.org. Also, Mark Boardman over at the Tombstone Epitaph. You can become a subscriber and join the Tombstone Epitaph. Arizona's longest running newspaper will be delivered right to your door. Also, my charity that we promote here is St. Mary's Food Bank here in Phoenix. They operate all over the state of Arizona. They're primarily in Maricopa County, but find a food bank near you, because like $1 on average will feed 7 people. $20 is 140 people fed, or makes 7 meals for a family. And so right now we're in June 2022. The recession is here. Prices are high. Fuel is skyrocketing, and people tend not to get nutritious meals and eat properly when they're trying to buy for gas or rent or overhead or utilities or whatever it is. So go ahead and donate. If you got $20, donate to the food bank, because they're doing some great stuff, and they're an amazing charity, especially here in Phoenix, and that's St. Mary's Food Bank. Again, I appreciate Sam for being here. We got just a couple of minutes, 2 minutes. Anything that you want to wrap up? Anything you want to say?
I'm really glad that you mentioned the Tombstone Epitaph. Mark Boardman and Eric Wright have been really wonderful to me and have allowed me to contribute occasionally to that. And that's right. I second what you said there. It's just a great publication for people to subscribe to. Wonderful historians and authors contribute to that every month. Every month they turn out a great edition, just wonderful stories, often lesser known events as well, which is great. Obviously, True West is still a great publication to subscribe to, and I'm glad you've mentioned the Wild West History Association, because going back to what I said before, it's just a group of really marvelous historians, much smarter people than me, and those are the kinds of folks that you find in this life as mentors that you learn from, and they turn out a great publication as well.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, and I'm glad you remember. And Mark Boardman and the Epitaph folks are a huge part of my podcast. Mark was actually he was the first person to say yes. You're the 31st podcast, which means we've got 31 hours of Western history to listen to. And Mark was the first one to say yes. Hey, you want to do a podcast? Sure. Like, I was shocked that he said yes. But I that's why we do the shout outs, because he's a big force in Western history, and he's such a cool guy, and he's a pastor in Poplar Grove, Indiana, I think, and he's just doing God's work, and he's just an amazing guy. So
wonderful person.
Yeah. So until next time, be great humans and safe travels, and we'll see you soon.